Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sat alone near Gate 43 at Charles de Gaulle Airport. No entourage, no cameras, no uniformed aides whispering into earpieces. Just a man in a plain button-down shirt, dark slacks, and travel-worn shoes, quietly scrolling his phone as the first rays of morning light filtered through the wide glass panels of the terminal. He could have taken the presidential jet. He could have demanded a private lounge, security checkpoints cleared, or a motorcade from the tarmac. But that was not his way. Ibrahim Traoré believed that true leadership didn't demand attention. It deserved trust. And trust, he believed, was best earned humbly, in silence, among people. To passers-by, he looked like any middle-aged African traveler, someone's uncle, a visiting academic perhaps. No one gave him a second glance. And he preferred it that way. He had just concluded a quiet but significant summit in Brussels. Long hours behind closed doors discussing Africa's mineral sovereignty and the future of the continent's independence from foreign influence. He had spoken plainly, without theatrics, telling European partners, Africa is not for sale, and Burkina Faso is not a playground. But now, back in the airport's cold stillness, he was just a traveler, a man eager to return home. The terminal bustled quietly. Businessmen murmured over coffee. Families herded sleepy children toward boarding gates. Flight attendants stood tall in immaculate uniforms, checking manifests and timing their smiles. And then, a new presence disrupted the air. Bernard Delacroix arrived. He was CEO of Euromin Energy, one of Europe's largest mining conglomerates, a man whose wealth came from the soil of West Africa. With a tailored gray coat and Italian leather shoes clicking against the tiles, he moved through the terminal like he owned it. Flanked by two assistants, he barely glanced at anyone, but everyone noticed him. When told that business class was full, Delacroix's reaction was swift and sharp. "That can't be," he said, flipping between French and English. "Check again." The agent did, then did again. The answer didn't change. "All the business seats are booked, sir," she said, voice tense but professional. "I'm not just a customer," Delacroix said. "I am a strategic investor in this region. I don't sit in economy." The gate crew exchanged looks. One of them whispered into a headset, calling someone from on board to handle the delicate situation. Claire arrived. Claire was a senior flight attendant, experienced, polished, and confident. She had handled everything from drunken executives to celebrities with attitude. She prided herself on discretion and order. As she entered the cabin of Flight 722, her eyes scanned the business class row. Polished, intuitive, sharp. Then she paused. Seat 2A. A man, black, alone, reading his phone, plain clothes, no jacket, no luxury accessories, just stillness. He didn't look the part. Claire leaned toward her fellow attendant. "Could be a mistake," she whispered. She approached him with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sir," she said, voice smooth. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Ibrahim looked up and nodded. Without a word, he handed it to her. She studied it. The name was there, the seat number correct. But something about him, his look, his simplicity, didn't match her expectation of who should be in 2A. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry, but we may need to relocate you to economy. We're overbooked, and there's a guest with high priority needing this seat. We'll compensate you for the trouble." There it was, soft, corporate, and sharp. Ibrahim lifted an eyebrow, but his voice remained even. "And why me?" Claire's smile tightened. "No reason, sir. Just an adjustment." "A guest more important than me?" She hesitated. "We're making room for a strategic partner." "No," he said calmly, placing the boarding pass back into his shirt pocket. "I will remain in my seat." It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. but it echoed in the quiet cabin like a gavel strike. Claire blinked. Her posture stiffened. She was not used to being told no, especially not by someone who looked to her like just another passenger. Behind her, another crew member discreetly asked a young black man in seat 3B to switch seats, then another passenger in 4A. It became clear. Only black passengers were being approached, Ibrahim noticed. So did others, and someone else had been watching all along. Vin Diesel, the Hollywood actor known for muscle cars and family loyalty, sat just a few rows behind, trying to enjoy the anonymity of international travel. But as he saw the pattern unfold, his jaw tightened. He had met President Traoré once, briefly, at a UN youth conference. What struck him wasn't the title. It was the man's stillness, his eyes, a presence that didn't ask to be noticed, but couldn't be ignored. Now that man was being politely erased from his own seat. Vin rose quietly. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the aisle. "Is there a problem here?" Claire turned. "Sir, please return to your seat." He shook his head slowly. "Number that man you're trying to displace. That's Ibrahim Traoré. He's the president of Burkina Faso. I've met him. And I think you just made a mistake." The entire cabin stilled. Claire's face went pale. A whisper spread through the rows like fire in dry grass. "Did he say president?" Someone murmured. Ibrahim remained seated, hands folded. Calm. He didn't need to speak. The truth had already done it for him. The cabin had fallen into a kind of stunned silence, the kind that stretches too long and grows heavy. Passengers turned their heads slowly, their expressions flickering between confusion, guilt, and dawning realization. Some whispered, others simply stared. Claire stood motionless, her mouth slightly open, as if Vin Diesel's words had stripped the air from her lungs. She opened her lips to speak, but nothing coherent came out. Vin hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was calm, grounded in certainty, and that made it land with even more weight. Ibrahim Traoré, meanwhile, hadn't moved. He remained in his seat, hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. It wasn't smugness, it wasn't satisfaction. It was something deeper. Stillness born of long patience, of years walking through rooms where he was first judged by the shade of his skin before the content of his mind. The moment lingered, uncomfortable and raw. Claire finally cleared her throat and forced a brittle smile. "Sir, I wasn't aware. We weren't told." She stopped herself, realizing too late how that would sound. Ibrahim glanced at her briefly, but his eyes carried no anger, only clarity. "You didn't need to be told," he said softly. "You just needed to treat me like a human being." The words weren't loud, but in that quiet cabin they struck like a bell. The kind that tolls when something important has been said. Claire turned abruptly and walked toward the galley, her shoulders tense. A few rows back, Bernard Delacroix, the CEO who had demanded the seat, finally entered the cabin. He looked puzzled at first, then irritated. "What's the holdup?" he asked in French, brushing past a flight attendant. "Has the seat been cleared?" Claire met him halfway, whispered something quickly. Delacroix looked past her at seat 2A, his eyes narrowing as he saw Traoré. Then he scoffed. "This is absurd," he muttered. "We can't run diplomacy like this. There are priorities." Vin Diesel stepped forward, standing in the aisle. "You're right," he said. "There are priorities, and one of them is dignity." Delacroix looked him up and down, clearly recognizing him now, and said nothing. But the look in his eyes was one of bruised pride, the kind born from realizing the room no longer bends around you. The rest of the flight unfolded in awkward quiet. The crew went about their duties with forced professionalism. Claire avoided Traoré entirely, never offering an apology, only a glass of water served without eye contact. Delacroix sulked in his assigned seat in the back row of business class, visibly uncomfortable, mumbling now and then to his assistant in clipped tones. Traoré never said another word. He read for a while, then stared out the window, his fingers gently tapping the armrest in rhythm with his thoughts. Vin returned to his seat. Once, he caught Ibrahim's eye. There was no nod, no smile, but a look of mutual understanding passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that something meaningful had just unfolded, not by force, but by simple truth. As the flight neared West African airspace, the mood began to shift again. Outside, the clouds cleared, revealing the red earth and golden fields below. Passengers began to stir, stretching, adjusting tray tables, recentering themselves for landing. The pilot announced their descent into Ouagadougou, and the usual preparations began. But something was different. A few passengers glanced back toward Seat 2A with cautious curiosity. Others seemed to watch the flight attendants more closely now, aware that this wasn't just another flight. Then came the first ripple. Someone seated by the window muttered, "Military vehicles." Another leaned over, peering out. "Are those armed guards?" Whispers began to spread again, but this time it wasn't confusion, it was awe. On the tarmac, a full convoy had formed. Black SUVs, soldiers in ceremonial uniforms, government ministers standing at full attention in the mid-morning heat. Delacroix straightened his suit jacket, clearly assuming it was for him. He chuckled. "Finally," he whispered to Claire. "They've sent the proper welcome." She gave him a tight, nervous smile, but her eyes kept flicking toward Seat 2A. The plane landed with a soft bump and rolled to a stop. The engines hummed down. Before the seatbelt sign even dimmed, the cabin doors opened and a tall officer in a black beret stepped onto the aircraft. His boots struck the floor with deliberate authority as he walked slowly down the aisle, scanning each face until he reached 2A. He stood still, then raised his hand in a sharp military salute. "Mr. President," he said firmly, "welcome home." The silence in the cabin was absolute. Claire froze, her face paling. Delacroix's eyes widened in disbelief. A few passengers audibly gasped. Others simply stared, mouths open, caught between embarrassment and shock. Ibrahim Traoré stood calmly, his expression as composed as it had been at the gate hours earlier. He nodded to the officer, then turned briefly toward Delacroix and Claire. "I hope," he said evenly, "that you've learned something today?" He didn't wait for a reply. He stepped off the plane and was immediately surrounded by ministers, soldiers, and a small crowd of Burkinabe citizens who had gathered near the terminal fence. Cameras clicked. The sun caught his shirt, now lightly wrinkled from the flight, and lit up his face as he raised a hand to greet his people. He didn't wave like a celebrity. He acknowledged like a leader. Back on the plane, Delacroix tried to rise, but two officers blocked his path. "You will remain seated," one said. "There is a matter requiring your response." "What is the meaning of this?" Delacroix demanded. "I am a guest of this country." "No," the officer replied. "You were. Now you're a man under questioning." Claire shrank in her seat as another officer turned to her. "You too," he said. "Disrespect toward the head of state is not treated lightly here." She stammered. I didn't know." "I was following protocol." "You didn't need to know," the officer replied. "You only needed to be fair." They were both escorted off the plane under silent watch. No cuffs, no shouting, just consequence. Vin Diesel remained seated watching it all unfold. As the cabin began to buzz with speculation, whispers, and low conversations, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let out a slow breath. He knew this story would travel far, across news cycles, across social media, across cultures. But for him, it wasn't about going viral. It was about something simpler. Sometimes, all it takes to change a moment in history is to stand up and say the truth. Out loud. And sometimes that truth sits quietly in seat 2A, waiting for the world to catch up. The blazing sun over Ouagadougou painted long shadows across the tarmac, where cameras flashed and reporters jostled for a better view of the unfolding moment. President Ibrahim Traoré moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, his steps measured, his face calm, unshaken by the chaos behind him or the thunderstorm building on global media. Behind him, Claire and Bernard Delacroix were quietly escorted into two separate black vehicles, their expressions blank, their confidence drained. There were no shouts, no resistance, only silence and the weight of realization settling over them. For the first time in their careers, they were not in control. No boardroom power, no polished smile, no frequent flyer privilege could shield them from the truth that had finally demanded to be seen. And the world was watching. Inside the government terminal, Traoré gave a brief press conference, surrounded by ministers and aides. His voice, firm yet composed, carried across microphones and broadcast feeds. He did not gloat, nor did he speak with bitterness. "Respect," he said slowly, "is not something you offer selectively. In Burkina Faso, we do not measure a man's worth by the price of his suit, the color of his skin, or the accent in his speech. We do not bow to colonial shadows. Here we bow only to dignity." The statement echoed not only across the press room but across the continent. Within hours, media outlets around the world picked up the footage. Social media exploded. Respect Africa and Preen I Stand with Traoré trended in dozens of countries. People shared the clip of Vin Diesel rising to defend a quiet man in seat 2A. Others posted side-by-side photos of Claire smiling at the powerful CEO, then being led away, her smile erased by truth. The public demanded accountability. Air Afrique scrambled to issue a statement calling the incident unfortunate and promising an internal review. The wording was vague, the tone corporate, and it only fueled more outrage. Activists, influencers, and journalists from Nairobi to New York demanded deeper questions be answered, not just about one flight, but about the systems that allowed this to happen again and again. In Paris, Delacroix faced mounting pressure as regulators and human rights organizations called for inquiry into Euromin's practices across West Africa. His lawyers argued for immunity, citing international business protections. But the Burkinabe Ministry of Justice responded clearly, "This is not a colony. This is a sovereign nation. He will answer here, under our laws, like any other man." Claire, meanwhile, was questioned at length by local authorities. In footage later leaked from the interview room, she could be seen wiping away tears, her voice trembling. "I didn't know who he was," she kept repeating. "I didn't know." The investigator across the table did not raise his voice. He simply said, "You didn't need to know who he was. You only needed to treat him like a human being." And that was the heart of it all. Back at the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré sat in his office, stacks of documents before him. There were roads to be repaired, youth programs to fund, infrastructure plans to oversee. The business of leadership continued, unshaken by spectacle. But something had shifted. The events on that plane had rippled into something far larger than a single incident. Across Burkina Faso, young people felt a new pride swell in their hearts. They spoke of a president who walked among them, who didn't hide behind glass walls, who faced insult without rage and responded with reason. In schools, children reenacted the moment Vin Diesel stood up, their voices firm, their eyes bright. In markets and cafes, elders nodded knowingly, remembering days when dignity had no microphone, when men like Traoré were told to keep quiet. Vin Diesel, still in the country for his charity work, gave an interview with local television. Sitting under a shade tree beside a group of school children, He spoke slowly. "I didn't do anything heroic," he said. "I just recognized a man I respect, and I couldn't stay silent while someone tried to erase him with a smile. I've been in rooms where I was judged by my tattoos, my voice, my past. But I've learned, when you see something wrong, say something. Even if it's uncomfortable, especially then." Later that week, Ibrahim and Vin met again, this time at a rural school his foundation helped build. There were no cameras, no press briefings. Just two men shaking hands under the open sky. One of the teachers, an older woman with gray in her hair and fire in her eyes, watched the scene quietly. "History doesn't always arrive with trumpets," she whispered to a colleague. "Sometimes it walks in through row 2A and waits for someone to see it." In the weeks that followed, Burkina Faso passed new legislation requiring international airlines operating within its borders to undergo cultural competency training. A commission was formed to document and address instances of discrimination in international travel. Other African nations began to follow suit. Across the Atlantic, conversations opened in boardrooms and media circles, not just about racism, but about the subtler, systemic ways power decides who belongs and who doesn't. For Claire, there was no jail time. But she lost her job, and more than that, she lost the assurance that professionalism was enough if not paired with empathy. Her name became part of a cautionary tale, not of malice, but of indifference, the kind that slowly chips away at human dignity until someone decides to stop it. As for Delacroix, the legal battle stretched on. He faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals, newer faces. But in West Africa, people remembered. Not just his arrogance, but the image of him standing stunned while a man he'd tried to displace was saluted by an entire nation. And Ibrahim Traoré. He continued to lead, not with a megaphone, but with resolve. He did not build monuments to the moment. He did not rename airports or release commemorative coins. Instead, he returned to his work with the same quiet purpose that had placed him in that seat on that plane. He taught his cabinet, his people, and the world a lesson they wouldn't forget. Not just about protocol, but about presence. Not just about identity, but about integrity. Because in the end, power doesn't shout. It listens. It waits. It stands its ground without raising its voice. And when the world forgets what dignity looks like, sometimes it takes a simple man in a plain shirt. A witness with a conscience and the courage to speak when silence is easier. That flight landed just once. But the story it carried will fly for a very, very long time. It starts like any other day until it doesn't. A black woman walks into a courthouse, calm, composed, and completely unaware that she's about to be humiliated by the very people sworn to uphold the law. They think she's just another face, another body in the system. They strip her dignity, laugh while doing it, and think they'll walk away clean. But what they don't know is this: they picked the wrong woman. Because she's not just another citizen. She's the one person who holds the power to bring it all crashing down, legally, publicly, permanently. What follows is a storm, a reckoning, and a courtroom twist they never saw coming. It was just after 8 a.m. when Marilyn Carter stepped out of her steel-gray Honda Accord and walked up the steps of the Thomas P. O'Neill Federal Building in Boston. The morning light bounced off the brick and glass facade, casting long lines across the sidewalk. She took a breath, smoothed the front of her soft ivory blouse, and clutched a slim leather portfolio in one hand. Her heels tapped quietly, each step a signal of confidence earned, not borrowed. Marilyn didn't wear her robe outside the courtroom. Never had. She believed in walking into spaces first as a citizen, eyes open, head held high, no symbols of authority to shield her. But that morning, no one greeted her as, "Your Honor." No nods, no recognition. Just another black woman in a federal building where power had long worn the wrong face. As she stepped toward the metal detectors, the energy shifted. Officer Carl Dobbs, a longtime courthouse security guard, spotted her. Ex-military, flat-top haircut, late 50s, a belly full of coffee and a head full of certainty. He didn't blink, didn't smile, just narrowed his eyes and raised a hand. "Ma'am," he barked, "I'm gonna need you to step over here." Marilyn paused. "Is there a problem?" Dobbs took a slow, heavy breath. "We've had issues with contraband recently," he said. "Gonna need to run a secondary check." Marilyn tilted her head slightly. "You saw my badge?" "I saw a woman walking in here without proper clearance," he said. "That's all I need to see." Calmly, she pulled her credentials from her bag and held them up. The badge glinted beneath the overhead light. Federal Judge, First Circuit. He took it from her hand but didn't read it, just slid it into his breast pocket like a receipt. "Follow me." Before she could respond, he turned and marched down a side hallway. She followed, jaw tight. He led her to a room off the main corridor, cold, plain, fluorescent lit. A folding table sat near the wall. A single surveillance camera blinked in the corner. There was a chair, a metal detector wand, and something else. Scissors. Large ones. She didn't like the look of them. "Take off your jacket," Dobbs ordered. "No," Marilyn said evenly. "You have no legal cause to detain me, and that badge you just pocketed confirms it." He didn't flinch. "Then I'll help you out." Before she could move, he grabbed the collar of her blouse, the blouse her late mother had given her the day she was confirmed to the bench, and with one swift, jagged pull, cut straight down the front. Buttons popped, threads split. Her shirt hung open, her undershirt exposed. Her breath caught, but she didn't cry out. Behind Dobbs, a young female officer stood, horrified. She didn't speak, just froze. Dobbs dropped the shredded fabric to the floor and smirked. "Looks like you're clear." Marilyn's voice was steel. "You just assaulted a federal judge." He laughed. "Sure I did." She reached for her ID on his desk without asking and turned to leave. He didn't stop her. Just leaned against the table like nothing had happened. "Courtroom's that way," he said, chuckling. She walked out, what was left of her blouse barely held together by a single button. People passed her. Some glanced. Others avoided eye contact. She didn't break stride. When she entered her chambers, the silence felt thicker than air. Her judicial robe lay over the back of her chair, perfectly folded. She didn't wait for an assistant. Didn't call security. Didn't cry. She slipped the robe on, slowly, precisely, like armor. Then picked up the docket and headed back into the hallway. Down the corridor, the doors to courtroom 4B loomed. Inside, it was standing room only, a major hearing involving allegations of police brutality during the Boston Freedom March the previous year had drawn press, activists, and half the city's legal elite. The expectation was that the judge would enter from the side door, robed, unshaken. But that morning, Marilyn Carter pushed through the main double doors, walking in front of 100 sets of eyes with the collar of her blouse torn and a story written in every line of her face. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread. She wasn't a visitor, she wasn't a victim. She was the judge. And she was about to change everything. The courtroom didn't breathe. Marilyn Carter's heels echoed against the polished floor as she walked past rows of attorneys, plaintiffs, reporters, and law clerks, each of whom had gone silent at the sight of her. She made no announcement, offered no explanation. She simply walked to the bench, past the stunned faces, past the rustling papers that stilled mid-motion, past Officer Dobbs himself, who stood frozen at the side door, a clipboard in one hand and the weight of dawning dread in the other. Her robe swayed slightly as she turned to face the room. Her blouse beneath remained visible, cut, frayed, violated. Her face, however, remained unreadable, calm not from serenity, but from calculation. She picked up the gavel and tapped it once. Court is now in session. A wave of stiffened spines and a collective inhale swept the room. Everyone, even those who hadn't understood what they were witnessing, now knew they were watching something that would be remembered. The first case was called United States vs. Lowell Police Department. The charges were heavy, excessive force, unlawful arrest, intimidation, and systemic abuse during last year's protest at Government Center. A group of officers stood at the defense table, stoic in tailored suits, eyes flicking toward the judge with wary confusion. They had seen her enter, seen the torn shirt beneath the robe, but the magnitude hadn't fully registered. Yet. Marilyn's voice never wavered as she acknowledged the parties and allowed the prosecutor to begin. Witnesses took the stand. A black college student described being pinned face down on the pavement for chanting. A war veteran, hands trembling, testified how he had been shoved to the ground trying to shield his daughter. One after another, their voices echoed in the courtroom like thunder. Throughout it all, Officer Dobbs remained still. When Marilyn glanced his way, briefly, his mouth parted but no words came. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her attention snapped back to the witness stand. Her pen moved steadily, each note crisp and precise. When the first recess was called, the gallery erupted, not in volume but in realization. Reporters pulled out phones, whispering rapidly, some typing faster than they could think. It didn't take long before headlines hit Twitter. Judge Carter appears to be assault victim. Presides over police misconduct trial in torn blouse. Inside the courtroom, murmurs grew. Staff whispered in corners. A bailiff brushed past Dobbs without a word. He was no longer untouchable. The crack had formed. And Marilyn? She remained behind the bench, unmoved. 15 minutes later, court resumed. The second witness, a young Latino EMT, spoke with conviction. He had tried to assist a protester gasping for breath, only to be shoved by an officer and threatened with arrest for obstruction. They didn't want help, he said. They wanted obedience. Marilyn nodded slowly, not just as a judge but as someone who understood what it meant to be silenced. She asked questions then, her voice sharp, her tone deliberate. And was this standard practice, threatening medics? The EMT hesitated. Not officially. She raised an eyebrow. But unofficially. He exhaled. Yes, ma'am. She let the silence hang, then turned back to the prosecution. Continue. By mid-morning, the courthouse was no longer just a courthouse. It was a crucible. Outside, cameras had begun to gather. Inside, the air was heavy with the weight of something unspoken, but undeniable. The robe no longer disguised the truth. And when Marilyn finally called another recess, the room remained half-seated, unsure whether to stand, speak, or simply absorb what was happening. That's when she called his name. Officer Carl Dobbs, step forward. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Dobbs hesitated, his hand tightening around the clipboard. Your Honor, he stammered. Now, she said with finality. He stepped into the center of the courtroom, eyes darting. State your name for the record. Carl Dobbs. Length of service in this courthouse? 18 years. She tapped her pen twice. And in those 18 years, how many women have you subjected to illegal searches? He blinked. Your Honor, Answer the question. None. That is incorrect, she said coldly. Because this morning, in that screening room, without cause or authority, you cut open the blouse of a federal judge. Me. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. You did not ask my name. You did not verify my ID. You violated protocol, policy, and the law. And you did it without hesitation. Dobbs opened his mouth. Nothing came out. How many complaints have been filed against you? I don't know. I do. 11 formal, all dismissed. And how many of those were buried? Dobbs didn't respond. Marilyn stood slowly, her hands on the bench, robe draping down her arms like a battle flag. Because of you and those like you, this building, a place meant to embody justice, has become a theater of intimidation. She turned to the attending officers. Escort Mr. Dobbs into custody. Do not place him in general population, charges to follow. The two officers moved forward. Wait, please. Wait, Dobbs called out. But it was too late. The courtroom watched as the man who had once stood guard now walked in chains. There was no applause, only silence. Deep, respectful, awestruck. When Marilyn sat down again, it was with the kind of authority no robe alone could grant. She turned to the clerk. Is the docket ready? Yes, Your Honor. Then we will proceed. The next witness brought the courtroom to another edge of pain. A local teacher, early 40s, described watching her students get thrown to the ground during a peaceful march. I tried to speak, she said. But when I did, I was handcuffed. Right in front of my class. Her voice broke. My students, they stopped believing in justice that day. Marilyn leaned forward. And do you believe in it now? Today, the teacher asked, looking directly at her. I think I'm starting to. The judge didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened, just for a second. Outside the courtroom, the news had spread like wildfire. Judge Carter orders arrest of courthouse officer mid-trial flashed across CNN. By noon, protesters had gathered in the square. Signs were held high. Protect black women. Stop the silence. The bench speaks. But Marilyn Carter hadn't done this for headlines. She hadn't spoken to the press. She had simply done her job, and finally, the world had decided to watch. As the lunch recess ended, Marilyn remained in chambers, quiet. A folder lay before her, sealed, confidential, left by the administrative officer. Inside, documents, complaints, emails, signatures, 11 prior grievances against Officer Dobbs, each marked unsubstantiated or no action required. All signed by the same name, Judge Lionel Ford, her former mentor, the man who once told her she was too emotional for the bench. She stared at his signature, again and again, then flipped to the last page. A memo, handwritten. Dobbs may be aggressive, but he keeps certain people in line. Let him be. Marilyn didn't cry, didn't shout. She just closed the folder and stood. The courtroom filled once more. And this time, the energy had changed. No longer just a trial, no longer just testimony. This was transformation. And Marilyn Carter, scarred, unshaken, undeniable, was leading it. By the time Judge Marilyn Carter returned to the bench, the courtroom wasn't the same space it had been that morning. The gallery stood not just out of tradition, but out of something deeper, respect earned in real time. She didn't wait for the clerk to announce her. She simply walked in, her robe trailing like a shadow of what had been stripped from her just hours earlier, and took her seat, as if the chair had always been hers, because it had. The air was still, charged, reverent. Marilyn tapped the gavel once, and every conversation died mid-sentence. The prosecution rose to call their next witness, a man in his late 60s named Reverend Elijah Booker, a civil rights icon in Massachusetts and longtime community advocate. He walked slowly, aided by a cane, but his voice held no tremor. Your Honor, I've waited 30 years to testify in a courtroom that finally felt like one, he said. He detailed years of harassment during peaceful gatherings, always dismissed as procedural misunderstandings, always buried under claims of security necessity. He had filed complaints. He had been ignored. "And now," he said, turning to Marilyn directly, "you've reminded them what justice looks like in flesh and blood." She nodded once, silently, and let his words settle like dust over stone. The defense attorneys had grown increasingly uncomfortable, whispering, huddling, exchanging glances with their clients. One finally stood and approached the bench. "Your Honor, we request a recess to discuss a motion to consider judicial recusal based on perceived conflict of interest." Marilyn leaned forward slowly. "You're suggesting I'm unfit to oversee a case involving systemic abuse by law enforcement because I, a federal judge, was just subjected to systemic abuse by law enforcement." The attorney shifted, eyes flickering. "We simply want to preserve the integrity of the court." "You mean the appearance of integrity?" she said sharply. "The same integrity this court lost when you defended officers like Dobbs for decades." He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Request denied. Motion may be filed, but it will not stall this proceeding. You may sit down." Her tone was like flint. The attorney did as instructed. The gallery didn't cheer, they didn't need to. The power in the room had already shifted, and everyone knew it. More testimony followed, each voice more piercing than the last. A social worker, a former bailiff, a teenage girl who had been pepper-sprayed during a peaceful sit-in, her voice barely rising above a whisper but clear as glass. Marilyn remained composed, present, absorbing it all not just as a judge, but as a witness herself. And in the quiet breaks between testimonies, the weight of what had long been silenced became impossible to ignore. Mid-afternoon, a clerk entered with a sealed envelope. Marilyn opened it, eyes scanning the contents. A letter from the Department of Justice. They were launching a full investigation into the courthouse staff based on reports and public footage of the morning's incident. Beneath it, another page, an official notice that Judge Lionel Ford had submitted his resignation, citing health concerns. She said nothing aloud, but folded the documents carefully, then looked up at the packed courtroom and made a decision. "We are entering into the record all formal complaints previously filed against Officer Carl Dobbs," she announced. "These include internal emails, supervisory signatures, and the names of those who facilitated their dismissal." A defense attorney began to rise in objection. She held up a hand. "Sit down." He froze. "Let the record show that this court is no longer in the business of protecting predators or suppressing victims. Let the record show that silence is no longer neutrality, it is complicity." The courtroom was silent, even the reporters had stopped typing. No one wanted to miss a word. "The justice system will never be perfect," she said, "but from this moment forward in this courtroom, it will be present." In the final hour of proceedings, Marilyn introduced a new policy proposal: mandatory anti-bias training for all courthouse personnel, psychological evaluations every 2 years, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. "This is called the Carter Protocol," she said, "and I will take it to the circuit, to Congress, and beyond. Because what happened to me should never have happened to anyone. And it will never happen again. Not in this house." Heads nodded slowly throughout the room. A few hands gripped armrests. A tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the second row who had once filed a complaint that was never returned. When Marilyn looked at her, she smiled for the first time that day, small but real. Then came the sentencing. Officer Dobbs, now stripped of badge and belt, was led into the courtroom in cuffs, his face pale, his eyes sunken. He stood before the bench, unable to meet her gaze. Marilyn stared at him, not with vengeance, but with clarity. "Carl Dobbs," she said, "this court finds you guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, obstruction of justice, and unlawful use of force against a federal officer. The room didn't move. You are hereby sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, without parole. You will be processed immediately. And for the record, your behavior is not an anomaly. It is the product of a system that chose silence over accountability. That system begins to end today. Dobbs didn't speak. He didn't even look up. He was escorted out as quietly as he had come in. There was no celebration, no clapping, just reverent stillness, the kind that follows something irreversible. Marilyn removed her robe slowly, folded it over her arm, and stepped down from the bench. She didn't return to chambers. She walked straight to the doors, past her staff, past the reporters, and into the afternoon sun. Outside, the crowd had grown. Protesters, students, community elders, all gathered in the square. When she stepped onto the courthouse steps, they didn't cheer. They stood, a collective breath, a moment of recognition. A young woman approached her quietly and extended a piece of paper, a handwritten list of names, each one a person who had suffered in silence for years. "They're ready to testify now," she said. Marilyn nodded and took it gently. That night, Marilyn returned home and stood before her bathroom mirror. The blouse was gone, her shoulders bare. The day had left marks, not on her body, but on her soul. Her reflection didn't show weakness. It showed survival. Her phone buzzed. A text from a clerk. "They're calling you the judge who didn't flinch." She smiled, but only briefly. She wasn't looking for titles. She was looking for change. In the weeks that followed, the Carter Protocol was adopted in 2 other districts. A congressional committee requested her testimony. And at a middle school in Dorchester, students put up a bulletin board that read, "Be like Judge Carter." One day during a civics lesson, a student raised her hand and asked, "Is justice a place?" The teacher paused, then answered, "No. But sometimes, a person can make it feel like one." Months later, the headlines would fade. But in one federal building in Boston, a robe still hung on the back of a chair, not as a shield, but as a reminder. A reminder that power is not in the symbols we wear, but in the truth we stand for. And Marilyn Carter? She didn't set out to become a symbol. She set out to do her job. And in doing so, she changed what the job meant. She walked those courthouse halls not louder, not faster, but fuller, with the weight of every voice that had been silenced now walking with her. And when the next hearing began and she stepped into the courtroom, everyone stood. Not because the clerk said so, but because they knew. Justice had arrived. And this time, it looked exactly as it should.